Yes, hi, good morning. And today I'm going to discuss George Eliot's a very powerful novel indeed, The Mill on the Floss. And this question, the very first question, The Mill on the Floss as an autobiographical novel, is a very important question because it encompasses many of your things as per the totality of the novel. So, let us start with this. Have a copy, pen, and paper to note down certain important points while I am teaching. Rest you can see and revise afterwards. The very first line, if any question comes in your examination, should be related to your question. For example, here, if I'm going to start this class or write in the answer, the very first line would be Mill on the Floss is an autobiographical novel. But it is not autobiographical in the sense in which the novels of Charles Dickens are. Now here what you did, that you made the examiner amazed, little more engaged, that this student who is writing about the autobiographical, he or she is now इवन डिस्कसिंग कि ऑटोबायोग्राफिकल तो है लेकिन उतना नहीं है जैसे चार्ल्स डिकेंस की होती है. सो हम क्या कह सकते हैं, इफ इट इज नॉट लाइक द डिकेंस ऑटोबायोग्राफिकल नॉवेल, इट इज सेमी ऑटोबायोग्राफिकल. और सेमी ऑटोबायोग्राफिकल को जिस पेन से आप लिख रहे होंगे उसको उसी पेन से हल्का सा अंडरलाइन कर दें. In this novel, George Eliot has put off herself than in any other novel. इस नॉवेल में जॉर्ज इलियट ने जितना ज्यादा अपने को रखा है उतना किसी और में नहीं रखा है. In that sense, it is more or less an autobiographical, but if compared to Dickens, it is semi-autobiographical. और कोई क्रिटिक है, some critic has said about this novel, the most authoritative account of her own complex character. इसको दिस कोट एंड अनकोट को अगर आप गूगल पे कभी डालें तो शायद वो क्रिटिक का नाम याद आ जाए या लिख के आ जाए, तो उसको नोट कर लीजिएगा. विच आई एम नॉट एबल टू रिमेंबर व्हाट इज द नेम ऑफ द क्रिटिक जिसने कहा है. फिर से मैं रिवाइज कर रहा हूं, रिपीट कर रहा हूं, उसको लिख लीजिए. कोट एंड कोट में द मोस्ट अथॉरिटेटिव अकाउंट of her own complex character, that is Mill on the Floss. And the novel is truly and truly a spiritual autobiography of Mary Ann Evans. क्या है? It is a spiritual autobiography of Mary Ann Evans. And the history of Maggie Talivers is the history of Mary Ann Evans also. Now, if you remember Leslie Stephen, according to Leslie Stephen, in the scenes of clerical life, she had made use of stories current in the early domestic circles. If you remember Adam Bede, she had drawn a portrait of that circle itself, and she now took herself for a heroine. And the first two volumes become virtually a spiritual autobiography. The scenery is supposed to be in Lincolnshire, and the town of St. Ogg's is said to represent Gainsborough. But her native district still supplies the details. And apart from this, if the important point here is her identity with the heroine, that is, the elder Tulliver do not represent her parents, and the brother Tom, it is to be hoped, was at most vaguely suggested by the real Isaac Evans. But Maggie Tulliver in spite of certain modifications, the remarkable personal beauty, for example, which has for good reasons to be bestowed upon her, evidently represents as clearly as possible what George Eliot would have been had she been transplanted in her infancy to some slightly different family in the same district. Although many of her best novels in the language are autobiographical, there is hardly one which gives so vivid, so direct a representation of the writer's most intimate characteristics. Now, further, we will find that there is a close parallel between the characters and the life story of Mary Evans and Maggie Tulliver. Mary Ann was the baby of the family. She was deeply devoted to her parents, especially her father, and yet she doted on her brother Isaac, who was 3 years her senior. She and he were inseparable companions. Tom Tulliver, precisely 3 years older than Maggie, he is masterful, affectionate, stubbornly self-satisfied, and a great hand at dealing out punishment. Maggie is the adoring little sister, emotionally dependent, with an insatiable appetite for affection. And all we know of Mary Ann's intimate history, indeed, we are justified in assuming that the story of Tom and Maggie, which is providing the underlying and often explicit theme of the whole book, is in spiritual and psychological essentials, though not in its actual persons and incidents. The story of Mary and Isaac Evans. Isaac, like Tom, was unimaginative, unforgiving, wounded in the only sensitive part of him, his respectability, when Mary Ann flouted convention by throwing in her lot with George Henry Lewis. This dearly loved brother would henceforward having nothing to do with her. She was utterly cast off, as was Maggie by Tom. आखिरी में क्या देखते हैं? Only at the end, in the specious and mechanically contrived reconciliation between Tom and Maggie, does the parallel entirely break down. For Isaac did not condescend to resume brotherly relations with Mary Ann until at the age of 60, and widowed of Louis, she made an honest woman of herself by marrying John Walter Cross, a man then in his 40th year. So, emotionally, spiritually, Maggie is like Mary Ann. Maggie, like her creator, has the intellectual potentiality for which the environment into which she is born does not provide much encouragement. She has desperate need for affection and intimate personal relations, and above all, she has the need for an emotional exaltation, a religious enthusiasm that shall transfigure the ordinariness of daily life and sweep her up in the inspired devotion on self to some ideal purpose. So there is, however, we can say a difference between Maggie Ann Tulliver and Mary Ann Evans. Maggie is beautiful. She is triumphantly beautiful after having been the ugly duckling, while Mary was plain looking and remained so all her life. But here, George Eliot, the novelist, has used poetic freedom to render an account of herself. In the earlier books of the novel, she has poured more out of herself. That is why this novel has the warmth of her personal touch. And if I talk about एक का नाम सुना होगा आपने, AC Ward, A full stop C full stop Ward, WARD. AC Ward ने बहुत ही सही कहा है मिल ऑन द फ्लॉस के लिए, कोट अनकोट, द डेविड कॉपरफील्ड और पेंडेनिस अमंग द प्रोडक्ट्स ऑफ अ लिटरेरी जीनियस. मतलब AC Ward ने मिल्स ऑन द फ्लॉस के लिए क्या कहा है जॉर्ज इलियट के लिए कि दैट दिस इज द डेविड कॉपरफील्ड और पेंडेनिस among the products of her literary genius. Matlab he is comparing with the top level, novels of Dickens with George Eliot's Mill on the Floss. Fine. So this is all about the autobiographical novel Mill on the Floss. Now we move on to Mill on the Floss as a picture of contemporary society. Contemporary का मतलब होता है समकालीन, जिस देश में जिस समय में हम रह रहे हैं उस समय और क्या क्या कहां कहां कैसा चल रहा है उसको कहते हैं कॉन्टेम्पररी. सो दिस नॉवेल द मिल ऑन द फ्लॉस, besides being the story of a life and the suffering of Maggie Tulliver, is also a comprehensive and elaborate picture of the English rural life in the opening years of the Victorian age. ये शुरुआत ऐसे करिएगा. Is the elaborate picture of the English rural life in the opening years of the Victorian age, before the dislocation and disintegration caused by the Industrial Revolution. तो एग्जामिनर को क्या लगेगा कि आपका जो नॉवेल पढ़ने का तरीका है, इन डेप्थ नॉलेज है, उसको आपने ब्लेंड किया है, इंटीग्रेट किया है हिस्ट्री पार्ट से. Because these starting lines are clearly showing that you have the knowledge of the Victorian age and you are blending that how and what happened.